Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. If you're new here, welcome to Black Cat Crimes, and if you've seen my other videos, welcome back. I'm Victoria, and today we are continuing with the case of Daniel Robinson. If you haven't seen my first video on Daniel's case, I highly suggest you go back and watch that, or else none of this is going to make sense. We've covered a lot already, and we're picking up about 3 days after he went missing, after we've switched investigators now. So when we left off on the last video, Officer Halley had completed his portion of the investigation at 11:11 a.m. on June 26th, 3 days after Daniel went missing. The investigation would now be passed along to Detective Biffen, who worked for Buckeye PD as well. So after Detective Biffen reviewed the initial casework on Daniel's case, he reached out to Ken again. This time he had more specific questions, asking if Ken remembered what Daniel was wearing that day. While Ken didn't remember exactly what Daniel was wearing that day, he did remember that Daniel was wearing an orange safety vest and that his boots were untied when he arrived at the job site. So just from personal experience, my dad wears those really heavy work boots, like steel-toed boots, and he doesn't always tie them before he has to go to work just because they are pretty tight at the bottom and stay on well, so it could have just very well been that Daniel didn't tie his boots until he actually got to the job site because it gave him a little bit of freedom to drive and just be more comfortable. So basically, this part of the report just included a less detailed version of what Ken had already told investigators, and after their conversation was done, Detective Biffen would then reach out to David. So the report says that David told Detective Biffen that he was coming out to Arizona because he was very concerned, but I'm pretty sure at this point David was already in Arizona, so I think there was just some confusion on Detective Biffen's part. So the report says that this conversation also included Daniel's sister, that she was on speakerphone with David as well. And it doesn't say which sister, because Daniel does have a sister who lives with his father in South Carolina, but I do believe David was already in Arizona at this point because he had come so early in the investigation, so I think the sister on this phone call was Davisha. David explained that he didn't know many of Daniel's friends in the area because Daniel was pretty new still, and so, they knew of some of them, but they didn't know if he'd met anybody recently. But because he'd only been there for about a year at this point, he really didn't know that many people. When asked if there were any friends that Daniel might go to, David mentioned that Daniel's friend Antonio had offered him an apartment in a redacted location the month before. Daniel had seemed interested at the time, but they hadn't made any firm plans for him to go to this location or move or anything like that. Daniel's sister also shared this trip to California again, just to specify that, he had kind of driven off once before to surprise family, but I really think at this point they didn't think that's what he was doing because he had contacted family so early, but she brought it up again. And at this point, we also get a little bit more information about the Instagram account. Basically, she talks about the fact that it seemed like all of Daniel's posts had been deleted off of his Instagram account, but it seemed like it happened a day or two before he went missing, not after. They also discussed Daniel's bank cards and any accounts David may have thought he had access to. And at this point, Detective Biffen advised David to reach out to an attorney to see if it was possible for him to get power of attorney over Daniel. Basically, if he was able to get power of attorney, he would be able to then gain access to bank accounts, his phone account, and any other personal, accounts that he normally wouldn't have access to, because at that point he would have legal power over Daniel and all of his, belongings. So the name of the company that Detective Biffen contacts next is redacted in the police report, but later it talks about him contacting T-Mobile in an attempt to get a hold of Daniel's phone location. So, I think it's pretty safe to assume that he contacted T-Mobile at this point. Like I said in the last video, there's a really weird pattern of what they redact and what they don't redact in this police report, and it seems almost arbitrary of what they decided to redact. So I would say it's pretty safe to assume that they're talking to T-Mobile right now. During this call, he was able to obtain the call detail records of Daniel's and put a continuous ping on his phone. And I wasn't completely sure what a continuous ping was, so I decided to look it up really quick. So basically, we're able to track phones through their GPS capabilities, and what providers do is they send out a little thing of data that then pings off the phone, and the phone sends a signal back. So it seems like what this would do was, like, the provider would continue to send data out to Daniel's phone in the hope that the second it turned on, or the second it got within range or came back into service, it would then ping back and give them the location data so that they were able to find Daniel. So the call detail records that Detective Biffen was able to receive were after June 24th. So at this point, Daniel's phone was already off, which meant all he could see were the unanswered texts and phone calls that detectives, family members, and friends had been, making to Daniel's phone. It didn't give him any information about the location or who Daniel might have contacted in the days before he went missing. And the next day, on June 27th, Detective Biffen would reach out to T-Mobile again and update an exigent circumstances form, basically stating that he believed Daniel was in danger, so he needed, to be able to access more call detail records so that they could hopefully find a last location and help him. T-Mobile was then able to give him call detail records from June 22nd onward, but they told him that he would need a search warrant to get anything further back than that. I don't completely get this. If Detective Biffen was able to fill out an exigent circumstances form to say that he believed Daniel was in danger, so he needed access to further back call detail records, then why couldn't he then, get a search warrant for those records under the same, argument that he believed Daniel was in danger? I just don't understand why that isn't an option at this point. If they think Daniel could be in danger, and Daniel's family also thinks he could be in danger or in distress, then what is so unreasonable about asking for a search warrant at that point? They could at least try. But he wouldn't ask for a search warrant, and instead, Detective Biffen would reach out to Antonio, who David had mentioned in their previous conversation. Antonio said he had last spoken to Daniel on June 17th, and he felt that Daniel seemed a little bit more hyper than usual in their conversation. He had been telling Antonio about meeting Caitlin and her friend, and told him that he'd hooked up with one of the girls, who we can assume is Caitlin, though it doesn't specify. Antonio also told Detective Biffen that, Daniel didn't have a lot of friends yet in Arizona, and even though he was really personable and got along with people, he could also be gullible. He mentioned a Facebook post Daniel made a few days before he went missing. The post included a picture of Daniel and his friend Luke, and the caption was a sun emoji and then the words "in for." And then Antonio was able to provide Detective Biffen with another friend's number and name, Ruben. Next, Detective Biffen contacted Luke again, and this time we would learn that Luke had been visiting Phoenix because he was considering moving there. He explained the Facebook post with a picture of him and Daniel in it. They had taken that picture in a bar while they were hanging out, and the caption was talking about the Phoenix Suns basketball team being in the playoffs. Luke had not been aware of Daniel planning to leave anywhere, and he also said that he didn't notice anything odd about Daniel during their trip. Biffen then called Ruben after his conversation with Luke. Ruben explained that he last spoke to Daniel on June 22nd at about 3:25 p.m. Eastern Time, which would be about 1:25 p.m. Mountain Time in Arizona. Ruben was asking Daniel about possible vacation spots in California or Arizona, but Ruben felt that Daniel seemed like he was off, like he was down or upset about something. But Ruben wouldn't figure out what was wrong during this conversation. As a matter of fact, the conversation was short, and he didn't speak to Daniel again after this. The report specifically states, Ruben said Daniel does like to hike and explore, and it is not unusual for him to take off and explore, but it is unusual for him to not stay in contact, and everyone is concerned for him. And after all this, Detective Biffen received updated records from T-Mobile. These records would show that 5 text messages were sent by Daniel before he went missing, but none of the contents of these messages were included in the records. The last text sent by Daniel was to Ken at 8:10 a.m. on the 23rd. There was also an outgoing message sent to Caitlin on June 22nd, which is that last cryptic text message we received from Caitlin through the screenshots. The world can get better, but I'll have to take all the time I can, or we can, whatever to name it. I'll either see you again or never again. There are also 2 outgoing text messages to Daniel's boss, Steven, but all the information was redacted from that part of the report. It also appears that whoever that 5th text message went to has been redacted as well. And in the report, there is no further update from Detective Biffen until July 6th. That's 9 days. 9 days after his initial report. There's nothing else in his supplemental report that talks about what he was doing or what information they were receiving during this 9 days. Now, I think this next section shows that police waited a stupidly long time to do something that should have been done right away. On July 6th, Detective Biffen and another detective finally went and gained access to Daniel's apartment. They spoke to the complex manager, who mentioned that Tempe PD had come by but never actually gone into the apartment, and that Daniel's family had come by several times, but she'd been unable to give them access. I mean, they waited nearly 2 weeks to finally gain access to his apartment and see if there was anything of concern or of note inside the apartment. Daniel could have been out in that desert for 2 weeks, or he could have been hurt inside his apartment and nobody would have known. Heck, maybe there would have been, signs in an area that they couldn't see through the window that there had been a fight. He'd gone back and something had happened at the apartment and they were looking in the wrong place all along, which is why I say that they waited a stupidly long time to do something that should have been done from the beginning. And so as a side note, this is why I just recommend to people to give someone you trust a copy of your apartment key, especially if you live on your own. For instance, even when I lived with a roommate, I gave my parents and my best friend keys to my apartment just so in case anything happened, they could have immediate access to get to me or to, look for whatever they needed to look for. And then whenever I lived on my own in another state, my best friend had a key to my apartment and she had permission to go in if something happened and to give the key to my parents if something did happen and they needed to get in. I guess the good thing is, though, that they didn't find anything of note in Daniel's apartment. The common areas were clean and nothing appeared to be missing. And nothing had been disturbed, like it looked like someone had been there in a rush or someone had been packing or there had been some sort of altercation in the apartment. It didn't seem like Daniel had packed anything. There was nothing valuable missing. They noted that his bedroom was a bit messy with some clothes on the floor and that there was evidence of marijuana use around the apartment. And I'm going to harp on this again. It's great that nothing of note or nothing that was super important to the case was found in Daniel's apartment because they didn't go in there for 2 weeks. So Daniel could have been, hurt or dead inside his apartment and just not been seen. What if he had fallen and hit his head and ended up passed out behind a counter somewhere and they couldn't see him, and had they seen him, that very first day that they were looking for him, maybe they could have helped him, and instead that's not what happened. Or what if he had packed up a bag and left and they were wasting time looking in a desert or looking around Phoenix and Tempe and Buckeye whenever he was gone, and they would have just known that if they had gone into the apartment or asked his family to go into the apartment with them, to check on things. And it's just beyond frustrating because it seems like that would be the first step of confirming that he hadn't been to his apartment, that nothing had happened there, and then we can make sure that, we keep looking in the desert from that point on. Nobody went into the apartment, so they had no way of knowing that Daniel hadn't left on his own, that he hadn't been hurt in the apartment, that he hadn't gone back to his apartment that day and then something bad happened from there. And that's why I'm going to say it. I think it's bad police work. I think they did a bad job there. But according to the report, Buckeye PD had been out in the desert searching for Daniel in 4x4 vehicles for several days. On this day, Detective Biffen and the other detective went out to this desert area and searched for several hours. And while they didn't find any sign of Daniel or his vehicle, Detective Biffen made note of several mountain areas that he thought Daniel might be interested in exploring. He also noted that once off the roads in this area of the desert, it would be super hard to drive over the terrain and the different vegetation without the right type of vehicle. Additionally, at some point in this day, Detective Biffin followed up on a lead that they got from someone who'd seen Daniel's missing persons flyer. She thought she'd seen him working at a Circle K. When Biffin went into the Circle K, the clerk said that they did have a young black man who worked there who was also missing an arm, but that he wasn't working that day, and his name was Malachi. He also didn't have a car, but he would be in the next day, so Detective Biffin could come back and see him then. When Detective Biffin came back to the Circle K on the 7th, he was able to visually confirm that this was in fact not Daniel. The man just didn't look like him, and he was actually missing the opposite arm that Daniel was missing. Detective Biffin also went around and placed flyers on the gated entrances to desert areas along the Sun Valley Parkway in hopes of getting Daniel's face in front of more people and that maybe they would see him out on this desert somewhere. He also would go to the Buckeye Airport and place, missing person flyers and maps of Daniel's last known location in this desert area in the pilot's lounge. His hope was that any pilots who had seen these maps and Daniel's missing persons flyer, whenever they would then fly over these areas, they would be able to keep an eye out for anything that might have stuck out to them, like a car or just something scattered in the desert somewhere, and then they would be able to report that back to them. He also reached out to Civil Air Patrol this day. He would speak to Major Dallas Lane of the U.S. Air Force Auxiliary and Civil Air Patrol. Major Lane said that they would be able to help search, and they were getting things together to be able to do a search in this area for him. One thing that stuck out to me is that Major Lane said that because they had a last known location of where Daniel was, and that Daniel was in a vehicle at the time he drove off into the desert and went missing, they felt they had a really good chance of being able to find him. But the plan was that Civil Air Patrol would use their trained volunteers on the ground and in the air to look for Daniel in this area. They would also need someone from Buckeye PD there on the day that they searched. They were working on getting the mission together, but it may take them a day or two longer at this point, which is what brings us now to July 9th. David mentions that Buckeye PD told him that the search for Daniel by Civil Air Patrol would start at 6 a.m., so he made sure to get there early. This lines up with the report because Detective Biffin wrote that he met David that morning there at 5:45 a.m. He then explained to David that the Civil Air Patrol search and rescue team were coming and that the first plane would fly out of Buckeye Airport at 6 a.m. Detective Biffin also told David he wouldn't be able to join the search for two reasons. One, that it was against Civil Air Patrol's policies, and two, that if this did turn into a criminal investigation, they would need to be able to maintain the integrity of the case. David obviously understood this and stayed where he was allowed to during this search. According to the report, the search efforts ran from 6 a.m. to noon. David stated, though, that the first plane didn't actually show up until a few hours after 6. There were 2 planes that completed 4 searches, and they show a map of the area, but I'm going to share that in a little bit because I actually want to talk about this map. The Civil Air Patrol group, while reviewing their findings that evening, actually decided that there were a few places they wanted to research, and so another plane flew over that area on July 10th for a few hours. And in all of these search efforts, they didn't find anything, any sign of Daniel or his car. During the search on July 9th, Detective Biffin actually received a tip that someone thought Daniel may have been brought into Valley Wise Behavioral Health. An officer was dispatched to follow up on this lead, and Officer Lacker confirmed that this definitely was not Daniel at this health facility. Following this, Detective Biffin asked Officer Cosgrove to assist in checking again all the mental health facilities in the area. And I find the word again in the report really interesting because there's no mention anywhere in the report before this that they'd already checked mental health facilities. I would like to assume that they did check mental health facilities, hospitals, and even other police stations, but they don't mention it anywhere in the report, so I'm just not completely sure if they did. So let's take a break in the report here to talk about David's recollection of the Civil Air Patrol efforts and the documents he was sent regarding these searches. So if you look up the map that's posted on Buckeye PD's website, which I have up on the screen now, you can see a little Jeep symbol where the car would later be found. Now, according to David, he was sent this exact copy of the map on July 9th 10 days before Daniel's Jeep would be found in the exact location that this little car symbol on the map. He says he has an email from Buckeye Police with this map with this little symbol on it from July 9th. Now, this is obviously really weird because why would there be, a little car symbol marking where Daniel's car would be found 10 days later on a map that was sent to David on July 9th? And I just have to be honest, I don't know what to make of that information. I have to admit, it is really weird and suspicious if it is true, and David seems very sure about this information. So, like I said, I don't know what to make of that, but I do know what it implies. So I'm just going to leave that information there, and I'm sure as David continues his investigation and when he decides the right time to show all of the evidence he has, we're going to find out what he feels this means at that point. But continuing in the timeline of the search and the police report, on July 11th, Detective Biffen contacted T-Mobile again. They redacted the name again here, but since they're talking about Daniel's phone and tracking the location data, and T-Mobile had previously been mentioned regarding this, it's safe to assume that that's who they're talking about. So he wrote them an email explaining that Daniel was still missing, but because this wasn't a criminal investigation, they probably wouldn't be able to get the search warrants that T-Mobile was saying that they needed to give him further call detail records, which that's crazy. If he is still missing and you feel he's in trouble, why can't you get a search warrant? And heck, if the only way you can get a search warrant is to declare this a criminal investigation, then do that. If you feel someone is in dire straits or in danger, you should be able to do that. And I just find that the fact that they were unwilling to do anything to try to get a search warrant, at least even asking for one, is ridiculous. I think what makes this even worse and what makes me even more mad reading about it in the report is that Detective Biffen specifically emphasizes that he doubts Daniel's ability to survive in the desert at this point. At this point, you're now worried that he's not going to survive in the desert. It's been over 2 weeks. Why weren't you using this argument 3 days into the investigation? Because think about it. If Daniel went missing in the desert in his car, he wouldn't actually even be able to use his car as a protective place to stay. Because eventually he's going to run out of gas, and we do know from the Uconnect system that his battery is very likely disabled. So that means that all his car is a hot box. It's an oven that's going to get baked in the desert. It's during the summer that he went missing, so that means his car is going to get way too hot for him to be able to stay in and protect himself during the day. But if he ventures too far from his car, it's going to be way too cold in the evenings for him to stay comfortable and stay healthy at that point. And we have to even ask, does he have food and water in his car at this point? So he was used to working in pretty remote locations, so I assume he probably has some food, like maybe some snacks, and brought his own lunch, unless they, usually left the job sites for lunch and things like that. He probably has water, like a giant jug of water or, several water bottles in his car. So after over 2 weeks, even with extreme rationing of whatever food and water he may have had in his car at that point, he probably is out by now. And you would have to assume that he was planning on being out there that long, not thinking, even if he crashed his car or something happened to his car and he couldn't get out, he's probably thinking, oh, I'll be found in a day or two, in a short amount of time, because people are going to come looking for me. So he's not going to worry about rationing a sandwich or 6 water bottles. He's probably just going to consume them and then be stuck without them in a car that now has no gas, very likely, and no battery power, very likely, because we know from the Uconnect system that's literally, if he stays in it, is going to bake him alive in the desert. So the fact that Detective Biffen used this argument that he's worried about Daniel's ability to survive in the desert over 2 weeks after he went missing in the desert is just freaking ridiculous. You should have been making that argument 3 days into the investigation, not over 2 weeks into the investigation. Anyway, in his email to T-Mobile, he also expressed that Davisha, Daniel's sister, was the account holder on this T-Mobile account, and she would give them whatever permissions they need to release all the call detail records and whatever information they may have regarding Daniel's conversations and location. So the security team at T-Mobile would then call Detective Biffen about an hour later and tell him that they were able to give him information back to June 21st, 2021, so 2 days before Daniel would go missing. But unfortunately, these records would prove futile because there was no location data whatsoever. The security team would explain that, we have Wi-Fi calling now, and so basically if you're connected to a Wi-Fi network, then usually your phone isn't sending data or processing any GPS location or anything like that. You're surviving purely off of Wi-Fi and not pinging off of any cell phone towers that would then give them location data on your phone. And unfortunately, Daniel's phone also didn't show up on any of those pings that they sent out after he'd gone missing. So it was very likely that his phone was off, dead, or destroyed at this point. And on July 15th, David would contact Detective Biffen because Daniel's brother, not investigators, had been able to get access to his bank account information. And this is when they would discover that purchase at a Shell station on the morning of June 23rd. David sent Detective Biffen a screenshot of this information. When Detective Biffen looked into the Shell stations in Buckeye, he found 3 that were relatively close to the job site. And instead of, being a detective, he asked the family if they could get any more information about which of these Shell stations he may have gone to, instead of, starting at the one closest to the job site and then working his way backwards because, detectiving, just being a detective, it's your job. He told them that once he got this information, he would send an officer out to the Shell station to see if they could gather any surveillance footage of where he may have been. And this is more than 2 weeks since Daniel has gone missing because they were, not willing to try to get any search warrants or try to get a hold of this information. So hopefully there's surveillance footage at this point. Right? We know historically, listening to true crime cases, that some places don't have surveillance footage, or, their surveillance footage isn't working, or that they recycle their surveillance tapes and, data pretty often, maybe a week at the most. And unless they're a really huge place, they don't usually have backlogs and backlogs of surveillance footage. And after a few days, they were able to get Detective Biffen even more information on some of the charges Daniel made in the days before he went missing. Obviously, the Shell station was one of those charges, and there was also a charge to Waffle House that they believe was made on the 22nd, even though it posted later, and we're going to talk about that charge in a little bit. So another lead investigators would follow up on was a Facebook post that they saw on July 16th. The post discussed a vehicle similar to Daniel's being seen in an area of Buckeye. Biffen was able to contact the original poster, who explained that his wife had seen a vehicle that looked like Daniel's parked in a desert area off of Jackrabbit Road, in some bushes. He wasn't quite sure which direction his wife had been traveling whenever she saw the vehicle, but she did take a picture of it, which the poster was then able to share with Detective Biffen. The report says that the picture was really too blurry to immediately identify whether or not this was Daniel's vehicle, but one note it did make was that the wheels on this car were gray, but the wheels on Daniel's car were black. So that was kind of a hint that this probably wasn't Daniel's vehicle. Detective Biffen would ask a unit to go look for this car before it got dark, and all the report says is that Daniel's vehicle was not located, and there's no more information regarding this Jeep. And at 8:54 on the morning of July 19th, a rancher would make a call to Buckeye PD that he had found a car in the desert that he thought might be Daniel's. Detectives would make their way out to this area, and the rancher would take them out into the desert where he found this car. The car was, in fact, the 2017 Jeep Renegade that Daniel had been so proud of and was so excited to show his family. There was significant damage to the vehicle at the time it was found. The car was found crashed in a ravine, and Detective Biffen notes that it seemed like the vehicle had had front impact going into the ravine, and then it rolled over onto its passenger side following this impact. Part of the Jeep's removable roof was kind of off and wedged under the front of the Jeep. The driver's side window of the Jeep was completely shattered, and Detective Biffen said that he found glass on the ground that was consistent with the vehicle rolling. All of the airbags in the car had been deployed, and there was also a lot of front end damage to the car, and the windshield had been destroyed as well. Looking at the pictures though, it feels like, damage to the windshield and roof feels like a major understatement. Like, this windshield is completely concaved on the driver's side, and the roof is pretty damaged too. So, just saying that there was some damage feels like a total understatement when this windshield is absolutely beat. Near the car, they would find a pair of inside-out jeans, 2 brown work boots, a t-shirt, an orange safety vest, and 2 socks turned inside out. Additionally, there was a wallet inside the pocket of the jeans. There was no one inside or around the Jeep, and though the outside of the Jeep appeared clean, it could have just been because there had been several rains during the time period that Daniel had been missing, and this had actually caused damage to the inside of the Jeep as well. There was a hard hat on the inside of the car that was upside down and filled with water, and the car itself was still in drive. The driver's side seatbelt was unbuckled, but it was locked in an outstretched position as if it had been worn during the collision. In the Jeep, they would also find Daniel's keys, his phone, his backpack with his work laptop, and some other documents inside. They also found clothing, a basketball, a case of unopened water, and some other just random belongings on the inside. Yet, even with all the damage to this vehicle, there was no sign of blood or any injury on the inside of the car. There was nothing to suggest that Daniel had spent any amount of time outside the vehicle or in this area. Really, the only thing that even said Daniel had possibly been there were his car and his clothes and all of his belongings. Biffen looked around and found a faded set of tire tracks that he felt were probably Daniel's. They looked like they'd been rained on. And so once he found these tire tracks, they came to the conclusion that Daniel very likely left the road where he had, gone west out of his job site area. And from there, he went up a hill and then proceeded to drive down this terrain rather quickly before he collided in this ravine. So they mention in the report that there is evidence of, vegetation and things like that and bushes being crushed by the car. But whenever you look at pictures of the area, it doesn't really seem like there's any vegetation that is super damaged except for directly in front of where the car, was found in the ravine. So I don't know what this really means, if it means that some of the vegetation had grown back already, or maybe they didn't get pictures of it, or that maybe someone had managed to actually avoid the vegetation as they drove his car out here to be dumped. There's all sorts of theories about what could have happened, but looking at the pictures, and other people have said it as well, it doesn't look like there's significant damage to the vegetation around there to suggest someone had been, driving quickly down this hill into a collision course, basically. In my opinion, Daniel's Jeep is noticeable in every aerial photo that shows it in the desert. So I'm kind of surprised that police say that they didn't see the Jeep in any of their aerial searches, especially when it does seem to be visible in all of the aerial photos that have been shared. While I understand that the gray vehicle could blend into the desert-colored terrain, it's also important to remember that when you look at these photos, you can see the Jeep. There were black accents on the Jeep, and there was an orange safety vest lying right next to the Jeep, about 3 feet away. So the orange reflective safety vest should have also been seen from the air. It wouldn't make sense that a helicopter, plane, or drone would be flying so high that it couldn't even see Daniel's Jeep from where it was in the air. After pictures were taken of the area, Detective Biffen collected the phone and keys from inside the car, as well as the backpack and laptop. He would also take the wallet out of Daniel's jeans, and inside the wallet he would find Daniel's IDs, his bank cards, his credit cards, but there was no cash. At this point, many other officers, the Major Crimes Unit, and a search and rescue team came out to search for Daniel. According to the report, a Ranger helicopter was dispatched to do a low-altitude search, a drone took aerial photos of the area, and 6 to 7 cadaver and tracking dogs were brought out into the area. Through a 4-quadrant search, they would search this area by both vehicle and foot for about 18 hours. The dogs and their handlers would be there for about 5 hours with no results. And the drone pilot, after taking pictures of the crash site, would also try to search this area for about an hour and a half until all of the batteries he had with him died on his drone. During the search, they encountered a mountain lion, but there was no evidence in that area that Daniel may have run into any wildlife or this mountain lion. Before nightfall, David's clothes were collected to be taken with the other items that Detective Biffen had collected for safekeeping. Not to be cataloged or put into evidence, not to be tested at all for anything that they could find, just safekeeping. The car was taken out of the ravine and then taken to Buckeye PD's impound so that it could be stored there until Daniel's family could be informed about the car being found. The way they wrote it, it never seemed like they intended to keep Daniel's car there for any length of time, not so they could investigate the crash, not so they could look into the car or, look at any evidence that may be in there. It seemed like they were really just collecting it and they were going to take it there and then expected Daniel's family to do something with it from that point on. And here's the thing. The reason I'm going through this report page by page, they released a 54-page report, so we should talk about it. I'm going through this in such detail because I want to give them a fair shake. I want to show what they did. But I think at this point, in my opinion, allegedly, as the great Stephanie Harlow would say, I don't think that they ever intended to keep this car and, study it, get any evidence from it, because, they have to maintain chain of custody if they're ever going to make this a criminal investigation. And it's pretty obvious from this point that they weren't going to do that they didn't think it was worth keeping, that they didn't even think it would be worth keeping a little while longer so that, in case something did come up, they would have the evidence and they would have chain of custody to make sure that all the evidence could remain intact if something, was found about Daniel. And I think that the wording in the report shows that. I think not only the wording in the report shows that, but the seeming lack of care regarding the car shows that as well. And here's really the sentence in the report that just boils my blood. We know from an interview that the redacted name in the sentence is David's. So the sentence reads, "At Mr. Redacted request, I arranged for a tarp to be placed on the vehicle to preserve from continued exposure to rain and dirt." Like what? There's already been earlier damage, so any evidence you have is already at risk of being hurt. But despite the fact that the roof isn't completely on the Jeep, the driver's side window is smashed out, that there's already been rain in the car, you don't feel the need to put a tarp over the car and just preserve anything that might be left in case, Daniel was hurt and this is foul play? David had to ask. They were never going to do that. So these are two separate sections, but I feel like there may have been some overlap between David being told about when the car was found and the search efforts a little bit. According to the report, Detective Biffen called David to tell him that they found Daniel's car on July 20th, and so David agreed to meet him at Buckeye Police Station to talk about it. They discussed the search efforts and what they found and didn't find, and The report notes that David seemed visibly upset, but also expressed his appreciation for everything they were doing. Detective Biffen would tell David that he'd like to look at the crash computer in Daniel's car, as well as Daniel's phone, to see if they could get any information about his location or what may have been going on before the crash. And David told them to do whatever they needed to do to get that information. So after telling David that they would continue to investigate Daniel's disappearance, Detective Biffen took David to see the Jeep that they had in their impound lot. And I'm assuming that this is when David asked them to put a tarp over the Jeep so that there would be no further damage. In a supplement report, Officer Price discusses that he told Detective Biffen that he may be able to get the crash data out of the car when they found it on July 19th. He warned him on the 19th that if they wanted to collect this crash data at a later date, they needed to be sure that when they took the car out of the ravine, that they didn't turn the ignition on or press the on button in the car. And on July 21st, Detective Biffen would make this request to Officer Price to download the crash data from the car. Price got the keys from evidence, jumped the car, and then turned the car on without turning the engine on. He downloaded the information from the vehicle, turned the car off, and then saved all the information to a thumb drive that he would hand over to Detective Biffen. Though his name is redacted from the report, it seems like Detective Biffen got the car's infotainment system data from the PI that David had hired, Jeff McGrath. The police didn't collect this data themselves, but it is kind of mixed into the airbag data that they got whenever Officer Price got that information from the car. So it's all mixed together, but the infotainment systems data is much more in-depth than the airbag data. When reviewing the airbag crash data, Officer Price found that there was no information regarding the date or time of the car crash. The data did show, though, that the driver's side seatbelt was buckled at the time of the crash, though the passenger seat seatbelt was not. I'm just going to read this quote so I make sure that I get the information right. In the 5 seconds before the crash, the throttle fluctuated from 78% to 22%, and 0.8 seconds before the crash, the car was going 33 miles per hour. Then 0.1 seconds before the crash, the car was going 30 miles per hour, and the brakes were never applied. And when Detective Biffen reviewed the infotainment system data, there was a lot more information regarding the crash. It recorded the number of ignition cycles at the time of the crash and after. So we know that one of these ignition cycles is from Officer Price starting the ignition so that he could get the airbag crash data out of the car, but there were 44 other ignition starts after the time of the crash. According to the infotainment system data, Daniel's Jeep after 9 a.m. was driven approximately 24 miles. So that's a much further distance than that 3 miles between the job site where he left and the crash site where his car would later be found. Additionally, there's an 11-mile difference between the crash data odometer and the Jeep's odometer itself. Now, police say that they spoke to someone at Jeep and that they said that this type of discrepancy wasn't totally, uncommon, but the employee they spoke to and where they worked at Jeep is not listed. Basically, they maintain that difference in odometer readings could be just a normal discrepancy. Now, David says that the police didn't contact Jeep headquarters to ask them about the possible discrepancy like this, but rather they just walked into a Jeep dealership and asked someone who worked there if this type of discrepancy would be normal. And funnily enough, I have personal experience in this as someone who worked at a Jeep dealership for about a month as a receptionist and knew a lot of the salespeople. You don't really have to know that much about cars to sell cars. And you definitely don't have to know a ton about cars to work at a car dealership. So if they didn't speak to a service technician or a manager or someone who would have the ability to reach someone even higher up, I don't know that this would just be common knowledge at a Jeep dealership, which is where David said that they, went to go ask them about this. But at the time of his interview with Mile Higher podcast, David said that he has reached out to Jeep headquarters and trying to ask them what they think of this discrepancy and if this means that the car was driven further after the crash initially or if this is something that could just be a discrepancy between the odometers. And now we're going to talk about the fact that it wasn't until July 22nd, at David's request, that police would swab the car for DNA and dust for fingerprints. Of course, they did this after Officer Price had already gone into the car and, touched the inside of the vehicle and the outside of the vehicle to get the airbag data out of the car. So, top-notch police work there, buds. At the end of this section discussing the crash data, Detective Biffen writes that he started researching high-level crash reconstruction experts to contact regarding the crash of Daniel's car. And it wasn't until August 13th that they would actually get in touch with this expert. And so one thing to keep in mind is that the private investigator that David was working with, Jeff McGrath, he is a high-level crash reconstruction expert. So, David, at this time that they have already been looking for Daniel and now they found his car, he has been asking police to help him by, coming out with the equipment that they have for searching, like drones and vehicles. He's been asking for people to help with the searches. He's been asking for resources from them this whole time to look for Daniel. And so this was a point that especially frustrated him because he was already working with a crash reconstruction expert who was, looking into the crash. Jeff McGrath was already looking into the crash. That's why he had the infotainment system data. He was, especially by August 13th, he had already looked over the vehicle and come up with, an explanation of what the damage to the car looked like, what the area looked like, and what that meant in terms of the crash. And so the fact that they, hired another expert to kind of prove what they wanted was a point of contention with David, and he felt like it was a waste of resources when they could have been putting their resources towards other parts of the investigation that he needed help with. On July 21st, Detective Biffen had done an initial review of the data on Daniel's cell phone. They found the 2 images that Daniel had taken of equipment and the logbooks for work at that first job site on the 23rd. They also found Daniel's conversations with Caitlin in the trash on his phone. The report states that the conversation between Daniel and Caitlin found on Daniel's phone was consistent with their screenshots that Caitlin sent. But just something to keep in mind is David does claim that there are further conversations between Daniel and Caitlin, according to his phone records. So there may be more information regarding this in the future, but David himself was not able to confirm this when he got Daniel's phone back at a later date because police would completely wipe the phone and take the memory card out of it before they gave it back to David. So David is currently having the phone looked at by someone to retrieve the data because, nothing's ever truly gone off of a device anymore. So he's hoping to be able to retrieve the information that was on Daniel's phone himself so that he can look at what they would have found. And on July 28th, Detective Biffen would go to the Waffle House that Daniel had visited on the evening of June 22nd, the day before he went missing. Basically, the charge for Waffle House posted on the 23rd rather than the 22nd, which is a pretty normal thing with bank accounts. And so we know that Daniel was there on the 22nd, though, because of his interaction with Davisha that afternoon. And like I was talking about surveillance footage with the Shell station earlier, thank goodness for these places keeping their, surveillance footage for a long time, because somehow Waffle House still had the surveillance footage from the night that Daniel was there more than a month later. The manager was able to let Detective Biffen go back into their security room and watch the footage to see what Daniel was like on the 22nd when he was there. Daniel would arrive to the Waffle House around 6:02 p.m. He was wearing the clothes that Davisha would describe him wearing later that night. He was alone and arrived on foot, and he would sit near the jukebox until about 6:27 p.m. when he was seated and served by a waitress there. After he ate, he would go to the counter and pay his bill and then come back to his table, sit, and put his food in a to-go box. And then at about 7:10 p.m., he was seen walking out of the Waffle House and into the parking lot. Basically, the surveillance footage saw him make it to like the sidewalk, and then he disappeared out of the frame. While there, Detective Biffen spoke to the waitress who had seated and served Daniel. When he explained why he was there and showed her Daniel's missing poster and the surveillance footage, she said that she remembered Daniel being there that night and recognized him. She remembered their interaction because Daniel had been in before. And so this night she noticed that he seemed skittish and like he didn't want to talk to her. She just overall felt that he was off that night. She couldn't quite describe his exact behavior, but she said that he just seemed out of it. Now, David believed that these gaps in times that are kind of in the report are when interactions could have happened between Daniel and someone else at the Waffle House. There's a 25-minute gap between Daniel's arrival and when he's seated, and then another 43-minute gap between when he, sat and got his food and the time he left. David was only shown stills of the surveillance footage, so he thinks that maybe, in these other times, Daniel may have been interacting with someone and this just hasn't been disclosed to anybody yet by police. And I find it interesting that Daniel sent that emergency text message to Davisha this night, like during this interaction, or during this incident, because David thinks that Daniel met with somebody or interacted with somebody other than the waitress at the Waffle House. And so it makes you wonder if maybe like something did happen that kind of wigged Daniel out or made him feel like he was in danger. So he sent that emergency text to Davisha to get help. And then later he either got out of it or was able to kind of walk away and felt silly or didn't want to drag Davisha into it. So whenever he got back, he, made a joke about just seeing how quickly she'd respond. But that kind of makes you wonder if something did happen at the Waffle House that makes him feel nervous or worried, and police just haven't discussed that with anybody because they won't release the surveillance footage. On July 31st, David's search groups would find a human skull a few hundred feet away from where Daniel's car was found crashed in the desert. Remember, this is the same area where, 5 or 6 tracking and cadaver dogs had supposedly been looking for Daniel or his remains. So it kind of makes you wonder, if there was an issue with the cadaver dogs or if maybe there really weren't cadaver dogs there, because there's a point where David claims that he doesn't think there were. And, there's just this skull is only a few hundred feet away, and from my research into it, it seems like cadaver dogs should be able to smell bone. That's part of what they're able to pick up. The skull, though, was weathered and had been exposed to the elements, so it didn't really take them long to see that this wasn't Daniel's skull and confirm it, and I think since then they have been able to identify who this skull belonged to. On August 4th, Daniel's Jeep would be picked up from impound on behalf of Jeff and David by a tow company. Basically, the report makes it sound like Jeff and David asked that the Jeep be released to them so that they could look into it, but David says that at this point, police were basically telling him that he needed to get the car out of there or he was going to have to pay storage fees for keeping it in the impound lot. So David and Jeff would take the Jeep so that they could store it and keep it and examine it and, make sure that they were getting all the evidence they could from it. So I want to take some time to talk about the findings of Jeff and David and their investigation, because I think what's interesting is that David doesn't necessarily deny everything in the police report. He just feels like details are wrong within the police report. Because really, reading the police report, it's one-sided. It's the police's narrative of what they believe has happened, and they're not really exploring other options. David believes if the police had done even half the investigation he's done over the past year, that they would have the same answers he has regarding his son's disappearance. And so after Jeff and David got possession of Daniel's vehicle, there's not really anything else in the police report that we haven't already discussed. So we're just going to move on to talking about some of Jeff and David's findings. Because while the police were waiting to check Daniel's apartment and doing occasional searches, Daniel's family was out there every day with volunteers and whatever help they could get, searching everywhere they possibly could. David used his military training to arrange searches in the desert, and the family even took a lot of time driving around Tempe, Buckeye, and Phoenix looking to see if they could spot Daniel or his car anywhere. Despite the challenging terrain of the desert, David did everything he could to search it. He got together volunteers and got tons of donations so that he could get the vehicles he needed, drones, put together the searches, get the equipment they needed to safely search this area for Daniel. He fought really hard to get national news coverage for his son's case, and now he's even having to pay for forensic tests to be done on what they found in Daniel's car. In their Mile Higher interview, Josh and Kendall asked David if police had been, involved in his searches, or if, Chief Hall of Buckeye PD had ever come out to help search or talk to him or anything like that. And David says that the only time Chief Hall ever showed up to one of the searches was actually after Daniel's car had been found, so it seems like it was right after that time. And so he came out with the rancher who found Daniel's car, and instead of talking to David or, telling them the area and, just helping with what they were doing, Chief Hall basically tried to take over the search and was like, come on, I'm gonna take you to where we found the car and show y'all. Do you want to see it? And David was just taken aback because they hadn't even showed him or anybody else in Daniel's family the crash site yet. So he was completely taken aback whenever Chief Hall was ready to bring all these people out there and just take over his search party whenever he'd never been out there before. David said that this is really the only interaction he's ever had with Chief Hall. And I get it. I mean, Chief Hall is the chief of an entire police department. And while I'm sure he's busy, I would think that given especially the coverage that Daniel's case has gotten and the fact that the family doesn't feel that his case has been properly investigated, that he would have reached out or he would remain in contact with the family, assuring them that they're still working on the case. So at this time, when the rancher and Chief Hall came out and came out to this search and they had this weird interaction, David was able to talk to the rancher. And it's interesting, according to David, the rancher told him that police didn't have 5 or 6 dogs out there. They only had 1. And they didn't even bring that 1 dog out until about 10 p.m. on the 19th. And listen, I know we've talked about a lot of discrepancies between David's understanding of the investigation and what he's seen and heard and the police report. It can be hard to imagine that the police would lie in their police report, especially kind of blatantly. And I don't want to accuse them of that because I don't know what's happening, and I don't think any of us really know what's happening except for them and David and his volunteers and his search group. But I think that something that's interesting about this is that they did find human remains about 100 feet away from where Daniel's car had been, and then they would find several more sets of human remains in this general desert area. And you figure even if 2 of the dogs that they had brought out that night, those 5 or 6 dogs, were cadaver dogs, surely at least one of them would have picked up on the human remains they have since found in the area. So, I think just a lot of details don't add up in what the police are saying. And so it makes you even more inclined to believe David, who has definitely put more work in on searching for his son. Additionally, David claims that the rancher told him there was no helicopter or drone that day on July 19th when they were searching for Daniel. As I explained earlier, there is a supplement report from the drone pilot, Officer Price, in the police report that was released to the public. So maybe there's a chance that the rancher wasn't there when the drone was out, or when the helicopter came, or, maybe this does go deeper than we think it does. I'm just not completely sure what I think happened because I do feel that David has put in more hours on searching for his son, but it also is, like I said earlier, it's really hard to believe that police would lie so blatantly in a police report, but I'm just trying to give you all the information. So let's pivot back to some of the private investigators' findings, and let's talk specifically about the car and the work Jeff McGrath has done in the car crash and looking at everything with that. So Jeff McGrath is an accident reconstructionist and a private investigator, and his findings regarding Daniel's car and the crash are vastly different than those espoused by the police in their police report and in their public statements. So Jeff explains all this in an interview, but I don't quite know the rules for including parts of other people's videos yet, so I'm just going to break it all down for you here with pictures on the screen. The first thing Jeff noticed when looking at pictures of the vehicle, and was confirmed when he examined the vehicle in person, was that there was a lot of damage to the driver's side of the car, despite the fact that the car was found on the passenger side. There's damage on the area above the wheel. The driver's side window is the only window totally busted out on the car, and the driver's side mirror had been folded in and scraped as if that was the side that had been flat on the ground at some point. Also, there's front-end damage to the car that looks more like the car hit a boulder or a big rock and then kept driving. This collision at 30 miles per hour would be what caused the airbags to deploy. So the front-end damage that we're seeing actually points to a collision from something that came at a lower level of the front of the SUV rather than the whole front of the car crashing into the ravine at a high speed and then rolling over after the impact. Jeff didn't believe that Daniel would have been able to get his car up to 30 miles per hour in this area because he hadn't been able to achieve that speed in his own off-road vehicle. The police report actually writes this off when Jeff shared it with Detective Biffen. Basically, Biffen just said that Jeff didn't know the path they believed Daniel to have driven to reach that ravine, so Daniel would have been able to achieve that speed and then crash into the ravine taking this path, but Jeff doesn't see how it would be possible. Jeff also pointed out two things regarding the windshield. One, the windshield damage is a large concave hole in the glass on the driver's side. It looks more like something, maybe a rock, hit the windshield at a central point, and that is what created that concave there. The second thing about the windshield is that there is red transfer paint on the windshield. Yep, you heard that right. Red paint on the windshield. Where's that coming from in the desert? And the most surprising find by the searches, other than the remains of up to 5 people possibly, was that Jeff found a sock near a pallet, a wooden pallet that didn't have a lot of damage to it, in the brush. This sock was sun-bleached to a gray color, but when it was collected, they found it to be a black Nike sock. The sock matched the socks that were also found at the crash site and all of the socks in Daniel's apartment. It seems like it was actually Daniel's sock in a different location than the job site or the crash site. Based on what Daniel has said, it sounds like he may believe that Daniel's clothes were planted at the crash site by someone else, and this sock is proof that Daniel or his clothes had been in other locations. Now, Jeff doesn't state that he believes there was foul play, but he's also not ruling it out. He just believes that what he's seeing based on his experience and his understanding of crashes doesn't match up with what the police are saying happened. David, however, does believe that there was foul play involved in Daniel's disappearance based on everything he's found in his own investigation. So with all this information, I think now's a good time to start talking about what could have happened to Daniel, what police believe happened, and what David thinks happened. So pretty early on, before this case went national, police put out a public post that said that they had concluded their investigation and there were no more leads to follow. After the coverage of the Gabby Petito case concluded and the discrepancy between the coverage she got compared to missing people of color was highlighted, David was finally able to get national coverage of Daniel's case. I would like to note that Daniel's family was not upset by the amount of coverage Gabby got. They felt she absolutely deserved it, and they are so sorry to Gabby's family, everything they went through, and they're glad that she was found and they have answers. But they just wanted the same amount of coverage for Daniel. That was it. They weren't upset that Gabby got so much coverage. They just wanted Daniel to get the same type of coverage. After Daniel's case started getting national coverage, Buckeye PD would delete the post that said that they concluded their investigation, but David still has proof of this post being up. And early on in the case as well, Daniel's family was basically told that Daniel's an adult and he can go missing if he wants to, which is absolutely true. As an adult, you have the right to walk away from your life and just go do whatever you want. But all of Daniel's family and friends felt that Daniel wouldn't walk away from his life and that his disappearance was very weird and unsettling, and yet police wouldn't listen to them and take it seriously. And so that's why David and the rest of Daniel's family started looking so hard on their own and putting so much effort into their own investigation, because they felt like they would never find Daniel if they just left it up to Buckeye PD. Really, from the beginning, they felt like police just didn't care. And I always have trouble going along with the whole they can go missing if they want to argument, because while it's true, the problem is that there are people who don't go missing because they want to. You know, they get kidnapped, or they're, murdered, or they go missing because something else has happened to them. And then because police treat it like they can go missing if they want to, they're an adult, he's a big boy, then we don't have the investigation that should have been done in those early days to hopefully find that person if they don't come back. And I think that's kind of what happened here. Daniel has been missing for more than a year now, even with all the work David has put in. And it's part of it is because police have not done much to help, and so everything David wants to do takes even longer because he's having to get the resources and research it and find all this information beforehand, when police could just do it, to be able to do these tests and get this information and do all these other things. Because at what point do we say that this is probably a criminal investigation, because Daniel has been gone for over a year without a car, without a wallet, without clothes? Like, he's gone. So at what point can we say that this is very likely a criminal investigation? So the theories that police have shared with the media or with the family kind of make me mad, because they show that he either has left on his own and he wants to be missing, so it's just not worth searching for him, or he's already gone and there's no way we can save him at this point, so there's also no point in searching for him. One theory revolves around Daniel's use of marijuana. They thought that he may have possibly smoked a joint on the morning of June 23rd that could be laced with PCP. He either smoked it before he left for work or on his way to the job site. And then once the PCP kicked in, he just decided to leave the job site and drive into the desert. And in his delirium, he crashed his car, jumped out of his car, took all his clothes off, and then ran into the desert. But there's no evidence whatsoever that he used marijuana on his way to work. In fact, there was no evidence of any drug use whatsoever in his car. His work involved being out in the desert, possibly operating heavy machinery, using tools, working with another person, having to be responsible for keeping another person safe, and maybe even going into tight spaces. Like, I don't know if they had to get down into any sort of well system, or, I don't know exactly what they were doing, but this is a type of job that wouldn't be safe to show up to work high on. Like, it's one thing to, be able to handle it well and go into your office job and just type up some reports, which I still wouldn't recommend, but that's vastly different than going out into the desert and using power tools. So I find it really hard to believe that even to begin with, Daniel would have done this, and so does David. None of his friends or family think he would have smoked on his way to work. Because even if Daniel wasn't worried about putting himself in danger, he seems like the type of guy who would worry about putting somebody else in danger and not being able to help somebody else if he was too high to do anything. Additionally, I don't believe that any of the marijuana found in his home has been collected to try to test this theory. Additionally, marijuana use is legal in Arizona, so it's probably pretty likely that Daniel was buying any weed he was smoking from a dispensary rather than from some random drug dealer on the street who would be cutting it with something. So let's just say this did happen. Let's go crazy and say that Daniel smoked on his way to work and this joint was somehow laced with PCP. That would make this a criminal investigation, because Daniel, who tried to use a legal substance, was then drugged, and basically tripped really badly and disappeared into the desert. Like, that is a criminal investigation because someone drugged him. Someone laced a substance that he was using that isn't illegal. So basically, by police putting this theory out there, they're saying that they think this poor man was drugged, tripped really badly, drove off into the desert where he crashed his car and possibly hurt himself, then stumbled into the desert, struggling with this horrible trip because he did not intend to take PCP, and they just aren't going to search for him. They aren't going to declare it a criminal investigation. He's just out there, probably lost and confused and horrified, sunburned because he stripped all his clothes off. He has no food or water, and that's what happened. Like, that's a criminal investigation. They should be looking for him and using everything they can to get search warrants then if that's something that they think happened. And, like, he would have been drugged. How could that not be worth looking for him because he is in trouble and he didn't put himself in that situation, if that's what they're going to put forward? So I don't like that theory because basically police show that they don't care in that theory too. So another theory they've suggested is that when Daniel crashed his car, he received a bad head injury. They basically think that this head injury would have been bad enough to cause him to become totally incoherent, and once he did manage to get out of the car, he then stripped all of his clothes off, stumbled into the desert, sat underneath a tree, and died. And then from that point, his body was, scavenged and taken by wildlife, and that's why they're having so much trouble finding him. But the problem I have with that theory, too, is that means that when they tried to report him missing early, Daniel would have been in immediate distress, and they should have been looking for him because had they immediately gone looking for them to the fullest extent of their capabilities, they possibly could have found him and possibly rendered aid and possibly saved him. And the other part of the theory that's so hard to believe with this one is that there is no blood in the car. And that was part of the reason that they originally weren't going to swab the car for DNA or fingerprints, was because there was no sign of blood in the car. So how can they then say they thought he got an injury that would lead to his death? And while internal injuries and head injuries can be very tricky and absolutely lead to death, even if Daniel did stumble off and die like under a tree somewhere or in the desert somewhere, and wild animals did, attack his body after, there would still be some evidence of him, like bones or something. We would still find evidence because a lot of times animals don't leave no trace, and they don't bury bones and things like that. And I think it should be noted that Jeff McGrath actually doesn't think this car crash was bad enough to be fatal. He doesn't think that there would have been enough impact for Daniel to get a bad enough head injury to kill him. And of course, their final theory is that Daniel staged this whole thing to run away from his life. So you see, the theory basically goes that podcast Daniel was sent by Caitlin. It's by Eckhart Tolle, who is a spiritual teacher. And so Daniel felt that this podcast spoke to him so much. It changed his entire outlook on life. It changed what he wanted, who he wanted to be. And so he staged this whole thing to run away from his life and join a monastery. Yep, a monastery. And they support this by the fact that Eckhart Tolle is a spiritual teacher, but I feel like it's worth noting that he is very popular. His stuff is really well known, and lots of people listen to it. But his teachings aren't like super radical. They're not like crazy, like run into the desert, give up all your things, live off the grid. You have to do that to, connect to the universe and God and stuff like that. It's not, he's a pretty mainstream, like new age spiritualism teacher, but he's not a radical teacher. His teachings aren't super off the wall. So the police report states a few times that Daniel said this podcast totally changed his life or it was amazing, and his family maintains that they never made these statements. So police think that what Daniel did that day was show up to work so somebody would see him. And from there, he got in his car, drove into the desert, crashed it, stripped off all of his clothes, left all of his belongings behind, and then walked to the monastery that is a handful of miles away from the crash site. And David explains that the monastery is like somewhat close to the crash site. Like, it's not an unreasonable distance to think somebody could walk, but you actually can't get to it through the desert, which is what police are suggesting, that Daniel just like got out of his car and did like a straight shot to the monastery walking. And like, you can't do that with the terrain. It's just not really possible. So that would mean that Daniel, naked, would have to go back out of the desert to some sort of road somewhere. Like, he doesn't necessarily have to take the highway, which would be the most direct route. He would have had to get on road somewhere to walk to this monastery. And I don't know about you, but seeing a man walking naked down the side of the road would be something I would report to police. So the fact that nobody saw Daniel walking naked down the highway or any sort of road to this monastery just doesn't seem like a good theory that this is what happened. Now, maybe he had an extra set of clothing in the car, but police themselves say that it didn't look like anything was missing from the apartment. Now, I recognize that I have enough clothes that nobody would ever know if an outfit was missing, let alone maybe like 20. I think 20 could go missing before someone would really realize that a large chunk of my closet was missing. But I feel like, given that they themselves, like police themselves, wrote in their report that there's no sign of Daniel packing anything up, there's no sign of him taking things to go with him, that he probably didn't like pack an extra set of clothing in the car. And given that they have no reports of a naked man walking down the road somewhere, he very likely didn't walk naked to the monastery. And to make this theory even worse and less plausible, police never followed up on the theory that Daniel went to this monastery. They never checked into it. David had to go check into it, and he can say that Daniel is not at that monastery. Now, if you really think about it, if Daniel did intend to disappear and he did it this way, he's a total mastermind. And David said the exact same thing. Like, he would have to be some sort of like convoluted mastermind with this mega plan to pull all this off. Think about it. He would have started acting a little odd and maybe a little off and sad to some people in the days and weeks before he went missing. Then a few days before he goes missing, he starts sending people weird text messages. Then he drove out to work, made sure someone saw him, someone who didn't know him that well and who wouldn't be able to be like, yo, Daniel, what the hell are you doing driving away from work in the middle of the morning? Or someone who wouldn't immediately know him and his moods. So he made sure that person saw him before he then drove off into the desert and crashed his car, then got out of his car because luckily he didn't get hurt in this crash that seems bad enough to at least have deployed the airbags. Then when he's out of the car, he strips all of his clothes off, leaves his wallet, phone, laptop, and his water. So that means that he didn't need water to like get out of the desert. And didn't seem to have any money on him because there was, no cash in his wallet, and there are no signs of like large withdrawals from his bank account that have been, released to anybody. I feel like his family would have mentioned that. And so from that point, he, puts on a new set of clothes that he probably would have had packed, walks out of the desert to some unknown location to do unknown things with an entirely new identity. And so that's crazy. Like, the fact that he would have really had to have had a significant reason to do that. And I mean, he didn't have a reason to scrub his entire identity and run away that we know of, nor that anybody has found in the year he's been gone, despite the fact that they have his computers and phone and everything else. And I would like to point out that in the past year, no one has noticed any activity on any of Daniel's bank accounts. He has not used his social security number. He's not tried to request a birth certificate or anything like that. So if we are going to follow the theory of he went missing voluntarily and disappeared, he's either living totally off the grid somewhere, or he somehow found a way to get new information, like a new social security number and a new birth certificate, and, completely remade his identity, which is a thing you can do, but I don't think most average people just know how to do that. So he would have really had to research and start getting this information, and there's no history of him having searched these things, or I'm sure police would have shared that. They would have gladly used this to point to the fact that he seemed to leave on his own. But so those are police's theories, and most of them make me mad, because if those are their theories, then they should definitely have been searching hard for Daniel because he needed help. But they didn't search that hard, in my opinion. I know that they did some initial searches, but there's so many things about the investigation that I just feel they did wrong and at the wrong time, and they could have done so much more and gotten so much more information if they'd done it sooner. And even if they had done it sooner and got absolutely no information from it, I wouldn't be mad, because at least they tried, but it doesn't really feel like they did, in my opinion. So now I want to talk about some of David's theories. No one in Daniel's family believes that he disappeared because he wanted to. They don't believe it was in his nature, and they don't think that he would have wanted to put them through this. He's never gone more than a day or two without at least speaking to someone in their family. And surely after the case started getting national attention and he saw how much his family missed him and how hard they were searching for him, even if he didn't contact them, he would have contacted a friend or Buckeye PD to tell them that he was okay and they could stop looking. David has not gone into great detail regarding what he found in his own investigation and his theory based off of that. He does, however, believe that foul play is involved in Daniel's disappearance. From what he has revealed, it seems like he thinks something much bigger is at play here, that something bigger is going on. Though he doesn't reveal exactly who he thinks is at fault, it's obvious he thinks someone is at fault. There's a section at the end of the police report that details a call Detective Biffen received from Jeff. It says that Jeff told Biffen a story about Roger, Daniel's friend and former roommate. So Roger came out to one of the searches for Daniel, and David came over to Jeff and told him that Roger had said that they wanted to tell him something. And whatever he wanted to tell them, he seemed distraught over it. So they went over and talked to him, and they don't reveal what it is that he told them. But whenever Jeff said that he would want to talk to Roger further, Roger kind of got an oh shit look on his face, and his face went pale. Like I said, there's no more information regarding what Roger told Jeff and David that day, and there's no information regarding what they thought may have made him seem to freak out a little bit. Also, a few times in his interview with Kendall and Josh, David pointed out that the statements that Ken made to police, he feels are lies. I personally don't know why Ken would have a reason to lie to police, especially considering he supposedly only knew Daniel for all of 15 minutes. But one thing that really stuck out to me in this interview was that when David talks about Ken speaking to him directly at the job site, Ken mentioned getting out of his car to spray rocks with red spray paint, just so he could mark the path that he thought Daniel followed. And so that kind of pops up again whenever you hear that Daniel had red transfer paint on his car after the crash. Now, that could be a total coincidence, but it's just something that immediately jumped out to me during that interview. But I always come back to what would a guy who only knew Daniel 15 minutes have to do with this or to lie about, depending on unless there's something super big at play and this is all like a major conspiracy. And David said he did have to step back and ask if Daniel would possibly leave on his own. He realized that that was a possibility, and he needed to really think, like, would this be something that he thought Daniel could do? Was he so unhappy that he felt that the best option was to leave his life and leave his family and try to find some peace in himself? David genuinely does not believe that Daniel would do something like this, because he knows that his family would help him in whatever they could, and that it would just worry them so much that he was completely gone. One thing that's important to know about this area is that it is, I guess, an area that's very high in drug and human trafficking. I'm not completely sure if it's like the town or if it's the desert area around like Buckeye or Phoenix, or just these desert areas like in Arizona where there are less people. In his interview, David mentioned that they have found several sets of remains during their searches. And at the time of the interview with Kendall and Josh, he actually mentioned that they had recently found a man murdered not too far from Daniel's crash site. That was like a recent killing. So it seems like this is kind of an active crime scene and dumping site. And so that makes you wonder, could that somehow be related to what happened to Daniel? David, sometime before April of 2022, wrote the FBI a letter specifically about this area. He basically told them everything that they'd been discovering and what he'd heard, and even finding the human remains there, that this seemed to be a really dangerous area, and it was known for the drug trafficking and human trafficking, and that even if they weren't going to help search for his son, that something should be done about this area. They should look into it. And nothing has been heard back from them. Despite the fact that David doesn't think Daniel would leave his family and cause them this much worry, he does state that he believes there's a possibility Daniel could have been leaving, that maybe things were just really overwhelming, and maybe he thought he could just get away for a little while. Maybe, he was tired and overwhelmed and upset and just decided to leave work that day and take a little time. I know that they did try to search the places that they thought he'd wanted to travel, and they, double checked that he hadn't used his passport or that he hadn't been on any planes or anything like that. So they did explore the option that he did just decide to up and go travel somewhere. But because Daniel has not come back and nobody's heard from him given all this time, he thinks that even if this is what happened, that Daniel did choose to leave on his own that day, that he was going somewhere, he met foul play along the way. Whatever did happen to Daniel, though, David said that he knew his searches in the desert were more of a recovery mission than a rescue mission these days. Really, Daniel's family just want him home and to have answers, and they miss him so dearly. I admit I still have a lot of questions after my research into this case. While it's hard to believe that police would cover up elements or lie about elements of their investigation into Daniel's disappearance, I just feel like there's a lot of discrepancies and a lot of weird things. So even in my opinion, it seems like they may just be fighting against some bad police work that they did, and now they're just trying to say that he left on his own, so it's, not their fault. It's just really hard to believe that without something bigger happening, some exigent circumstance, that Daniel just would have completely disappeared from his life for what are kind of average stressful reasons, rejection from someone you're interested in, and feeling depressed and facing some money issues. Now, altogether, those can be extremely stressful, and I know depression can make people do a lot of things, but this would be extremely extenuating circumstances. And if Daniel did have some sort of situation where his depression or his just like being upset with everything that was going on got so bad that he had some sort of like mental break, and just decided to run off and somehow got hurt, that would still mean that he was in distress and he should have been looked for harder. But I mean, David and his searchers have searched that desert extensively. And I think that if Daniel was just in that desert somewhere, having passed away, they would have found him by now. Thinking about what Ken said and what was going on with Daniel that day, I have to wonder if maybe whenever he was staring out into the desert, maybe he saw something that was interesting to him. And so when Ken said that he was going to go check the weather, Daniel decided that he would just drive over to what he saw and check it out for a minute and then come right back. He didn't even feel the need to say anything to Ken because he really intended to just draw it out to this point, see something, and then come back. But, there is a history of drug trafficking and human trafficking in this area. So what if Daniel was driving out to go look at something that he saw that he had been staring so hard at when he was talking to Ken, and when he got there, or while he was on his way there, he ran into something that kind of led to foul play happening, that, he saw some drug deals that were going down that someone didn't want him to see, or he saw something worse like human trafficking happening, and so he got caught up in that, and that's how the foul play came involved whenever he did just, drive away. I think unfortunately there's just a lot that we don't know, and until police can either reveal more of what they found, or until David is ready to reveal what he's found in his investigation, or feels like he's reached a conclusion in his investigation, I don't think that we're going to know much more than we do now. In an interview with CNN, Chief Hall agreed that he thought Daniel had gone missing under very suspicious circumstances. So I have to wonder, at what point, when someone goes missing under very suspicious circumstances, are you allowed to declare that this is now a criminal investigation? I think the worst part about the theories that police have put forth, even after knowing that Chief Hall agrees that he's gone missing under very suspicious circumstances, is that the theories themselves have him either being drugged or in some sort of mental or physical distress. And so, short of him just masterminding his disappearance and completely leaving on his own, these are situations where someone needs immediate help. In the theories they've put forth, Daniel needed help. Whether it was being drugged or getting hurt or being in a state where he wasn't making sound decisions, he needed people out there looking for him immediately. He needed immediate and constant help. And there could have been signs of it in his apartment if they had gone there. There could have been... there's so many things that I feel they should have looked into earlier that they just didn't, and they dropped the ball that way. Really, given the theories that they've put forth, they think, for the most part, that he's probably passed away in the desert, and they're just like, he's out there. Don't need to look for him anymore. And I think the lack of care is shown in their shoddy action and inaction. But David has said he's not going home without his son. He just can't. He and the rest of his family are still working tirelessly to find Daniel. But now, instead of searching in the desert, he's switching his focus to try to do forensic tests on, Daniel's car, and making sure that he was actually in the car at the time of the crash, and to see if possibly there was blood in the car at some point and then it was cleaned out. Just different things like that to let them know that Daniel was in the car at the time of impact, or he wasn't, so that they know where they should be searching and what could possibly have happened. David has also started the Daniel Robinson Foundation. His goal with the foundation is to help other families, especially families of color, in their searches for their missing loved ones, because so often families are left requesting searches and asking for more effort to be made, and having to, do all these extra things that families just shouldn't have to do when their loved ones go missing. He knows how overwhelming it can be and how much work goes into it, and he's hoping that with this foundation they'll be able to give, a little bit of comfort and make the process just a little bit easier, so that they can focus on finding their loved one and processing their emotions, rather than trying to basically learn how to do an entire full-scale search like he's had to do. And David still needs help in his search for Daniel. Though he's received many donations and he appreciates every single one of them, he explains that searching and doing the tests he's doing and getting the equipment he's had to get costs so much money that he's just constantly having to spend money on flyers and equipment and forensic testing and search efforts and investigators and all these different things. So even though he's received a lot of donations, he still needs whatever help he can get. So if you can donate, every little bit helps, and I've linked his GoFundMe down below in case you can donate. Also, Daniel's missing persons poster can be downloaded on the Please Help Find Daniel website. So basically, David is asking that if you can print out this missing persons poster and, spread them in your local community, hang them up where you can, and give them to other people, because he's hoping that if he can get Daniel's face out everywhere, that it'll get to the right person who can help them find Daniel. Additionally, he doesn't want people to forget about Daniel and the fact that they're still looking for him. And if you can't afford to print the posters yourself, there's a way to submit your information, like your address, to him on the website, and I think they'll print the posters for you, and then they'll get sent to you and you can hand them out from there. So if there's any sort of way you want to get involved, there's lots of different options here. And it sounds like David has really made the transition to doing forensic testing rather than physical searches on the ground. And I think they may still occasionally be doing desert searches, but when they do these searches, they're very well arranged. Everybody is accounted for. This is really rough terrain and it sounds like a dangerous area. So he does not ask that anybody who may be in this area, who lives there or visits, go out searching on their own for Daniel. He really doesn't want anybody else to get hurt or go missing. And so if you do want to participate, you can keep an eye on the Please Help Find Daniel website, because they do update whenever they're doing new searches. So you should be able to find that information on there the next time they have a search. And when they do, you can sign up for the search and go out and help. And that way, everybody's safe, everybody is kept track of, there's other people watching out for you. But David really doesn't want people going out into the desert on their own looking for Daniel. Finally, there's a change.org petition for Daniel that I've linked down below as well. This petition is to change Daniel's missing persons case to a criminal investigation. At that point, police will be able to get search warrants, do forensic testing, and get all these things that they haven't gotten in the more than a year Daniel's been missing. And if this change is made, David and his PI will be able to hand over information that they have found to police to help, get these search warrants. But because it's not a criminal investigation, they can't really get these search warrants, and they can't get all these extra tests done and all these things that they need to hopefully be able to find Daniel. I've signed this petition because I definitely think that it's time for his investigation to be changed to a criminal one. So if you feel so inclined, please sign it as well, because I think they're close to the amount of signatures they need, but they haven't quite reached it yet. And finally, if anyone watching or listening has any information, has maybe seen Daniel, or has heard something, please contact investigators. You can either call Buckeye PD at 623-349-6411, or you can call and text a 24/7 tip line at 844-602-0660. And I would also like to say, if any of Daniel's family members have somehow seen this video and you would like to add anything to what I've covered, or you would like another platform to speak about Daniel on, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to give you the space to speak or to make an update to this video. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I know this was another long case. Probably every video I make will be long if the case has the details, because I think that covering all the details of every case are so important, especially in cases like this, because I think that if Daniel still is somehow alive out there in the world somewhere, just staying away from everyone. It's going to be the details that help us find him. I know Daniel's family have, for the past year, and probably will continue to do so, dedicated their lives to looking for him, and I want nothing more than for them to be able to find answers. My heart goes out to them. I really hope that their searches will pay off, and that, maybe these tests that David is having run will give them a new direction to search in for him. Please consider helping out Daniel's family however you can in their search for him. I totally get that money is tight sometimes, so if you can't donate anything, consider signing that change.org petition. Hopefully it will get Buckeye PD to finally change this from a missing persons case to a criminal investigation, as I think it should be. And if you've enjoyed my coverage of this case, please leave a like on this video. It helps out a lot. And if you'd like to be notified when my next video comes out, please hit that subscribe button down below. And finally, if you have any suggestions for future cases, please let me know in the comments down below. But I want to say again, thank you so much for joining me as we talked about Daniel's case today. I really, really hope that they are going to start getting some answers soon, because I know his family is just doing everything they can to find him. I'd also like to thank you all for the growth that my little channel has had already. I'm so excited with how it's growing, and I will be back very soon with another video. Please stay safe out there. Thanks, you guys. Bye.